Oh, hey, Matt.
Hey there.
How's it going?
Still alive.
Yeah. How's the little one?
She'll be 1 year old on Friday.
That's crazy.
I know, man. I don't know where that year went.
Hmm.
Well, I spent half of it in my basement, so that's where it went. But yeah, she'll be 1 on Friday.
Awesome. All right. Well, we got a good crew. We got about 9 or 10 press on. To those of you just joining in, we'll get started here in a minute. We'll kick it to Molly and Ralph and UTBB. My name is Sam Snyder with Wild Salmon Center, helping make this all go. But we're glad you could join us on a Monday morning.
Alana, do you want me to start right out as soon as we go live?
Yeah, I think we're live now, so we're ready to roll. Welcome everybody, and thank you, Ralph, for taking it over for us today.
All right, welcome and thanks for joining us today to hear from scientific experts and local Bristol Bay leaders regarding the major issues with Pebble Mine's final environmental impact statement, otherwise known as the final EIS. Before we begin, please hold your questions to the end, where we will open it up to questions for the panelists from the media. My name is Ralph Anderson. I'm the president and CEO of the Bristol Bay Native Association, composed of 31 Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq tribes of the Bristol Bay region. I'm Yupik and Danish. I'm from Clark's Point and now work and live in Dillingham. While the EIS was just published on Friday, the experts you'll hear from today reviewed the document and will provide a clear overview of the Corps' incomplete and problematic assessment of the impacts Pebble will have on Bristol Bay's waters, fisheries, and people. It also remains clear the Corps didn't take seriously the concerns from state, federal, and tribal cooperating agencies, the public, or Congress, as the document remains virtually the same as earlier drafts of the EIS, dangerously underestimating and ignoring the devastating impacts Pebble would have on our region. Today we have experts in mining, water, and economics to discuss the problems with the final EIS. Before we begin with the panel, I'd like to start with some background of Bristol Bay's position and our experience over the last 2 years in this process. For nearly 2 decades, our people have fought to protect our way of life from the development of the Pebble Mine. In that same time, our opposition has been unwavering, unchanged, not willing to risk our lands and cultures for a short-term gold mine. Poll after poll shows about 80% of our region's residents oppose Pebble and want Bristol Bay's pristine lands and waters protected for generations to come. Throughout this time, we've packed public hearing rooms to testify, flooded comment periods, sent thousands of letters, and advocated for the protection of our region from this mine in local, state, and federal arenas. We continue to fight tirelessly because science, facts, and history make it clear Pebble would have an irreversible and devastating impact on our watershed and our people. Today we've been joined by millions of Americans, fishermen, environmentalists, jewelers, sportsmen, consumers, and other tribes in our fight to protect the national treasure that is our home. We've seen 6 major investors pull out of the project, and we're watching Pebble currently try to fundraise for a mine that has no economic feasibility study, social license, and no access rights to develop this toxic project. Yet due to a process driven by politics instead of science, We're here to address that broken process that produced a broken FEIS. An EIS is supposed to thoroughly assess the impact of a project on the environmental people. In our case, the impacts of a fishery that not only has sustained our indigenous people for millennia, but also a commercial and sports fishery that supports over 14,000 sustainable American jobs and contributes over $1 billion annually to the American economy. Despite all Pebble puts at risk in Bristol Bay, we've been steamrolled through a process that the Corps continues to disregard our concerns. At an unprecedented pace, the Corps published an FEIS that completely fails to assess impacts Pebble will have on Bristol Bay. It ignores the existing science that proves that this type of mine at the headwaters of our watershed will, without a doubt, have irreversible, devastating impacts on the water, fish, and people who depend on this region. We refuse to sit silently as this administration ignores the science and will of the people by prioritizing a foreign mining company over the rights of American citizens. We're thankful to be joined by a panel of technical experts who will discuss the failures of the EIS in detail. Again, please hold your questions until the end when we will open up the conference call to questions from the media. So let's begin. First, we'll hear from Richard Borden, a former head of environment for Rio Tinto's Copper and Diamonds Group, with over 30 years of experience in the mining and consulting industries. He'll share some of the financial issues with the mine and the major impact it will have on Bristol Bay, along with concerns about the water treatment plans, mine closure plans, and lack of mitigation for the damage being done. Richard?
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to speak with you all today. The final environmental impact statement for the Pebble project remains fatally flawed and clearly does not meet industry standard practice. Many of the most significant technical deficiencies identified in the draft EIS last year have not been addressed. The final EIS still commonly understates potential impacts, provides inadequate review of many risks, and defers essential analyses and designs to the post-EIS period. Unfortunately, I will only have time to speak about 4 of the most egregious examples today: project economics, mine closure, water treatment, and compensatory mitigation. The mine plan being evaluated by the EIS is almost certainly not economically feasible. The 20-year mine only targets 10% of the ore body and by necessity must process relatively low-grade ore. It only produces half as much metal for sale as the only publicly available rigorous economic evaluation of the ore body, which was completed by Wardrop in 2011. The mine evaluated by the final EIS would also make roughly $15 billion less profit over its life than the 2011 plan. According to a net present analysis, which I performed, the final EIS mine plan is almost certain to lose billions of dollars in value. In order to be profitable, a much larger mine will eventually need to be built. The EIS thus fails to the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative, and the entire process is compromised because the impacts and risks being evaluated are much smaller than those actually required for a full-scale, economically viable project. Even a small expansion of the project to mine 20% of the ore body would almost double the size of the disturbed footprint, quadruple water quality risk, and spread large-scale impacts to different river basins. This fundamental flaw remains unaddressed, despite the fact that it was strongly highlighted by stakeholders over a year ago. Successful closure of the Pebble Mine will also be challenging and costly. In particular, water treatment will be needed for many decades to centuries after mining ends. Closure costs are almost certain to exceed $1.5 billion and are likely to exceed $2 billion, even for the 20-year mine. Given the poor economics of the proposed mine plan, it is unclear how the owner would pay for closure after only 20 years of production. However, despite this significant risk, the available closure plan is only conceptual in nature and contains no cost estimate. Instead, resolution of this issue has been deferred until after the EIS is completed. Given the high geochemical risks of the Pebble ore body, the very wet climate, and the extreme sensitivity of the Bristol Bay watershed, water treatment at the proposed mine is also an issue of critical importance. The final EIS estimates that 13,000 gallons per minute on average will require treatment during operation, and 26,000 gallons per minute of water will need treatment in early closure. To meet the necessarily stringent discharge limits, the proposed treatment plants are extremely complex, with 5 to 10 individual treatment steps. As is clearly acknowledged within Appendix K of the final EIS, the proposal to treat such high flows with such complex processes is unprecedented and has not been attempted anywhere else in the world. The final EIS also clearly acknowledges that the contaminant removal efficiencies assumed for the treatment plants at Pebble are, and I quote, quite high relative to performance observed at other operating mine treatment systems in the world. Given the profound risk posed to water quality and fish habitat, it is baffling that more detailed design work, along with laboratory and pilot scale testing of the unproven treatment process, has been deferred until after the EIS is completed. Without this work, any conclusions in the final EIS showing a lack of harm to downstream receiving water quality are not technically defensible. Lastly, the compensatory mitigation plan, which is intended to identify offsets for the large, unavoidable impacts to wetlands, streams, and rivers in the Bristol Bay region that result from the mine, is inadequate. These impacts that would be caused by the mine include the permanent loss of nearly 100% of current ecosystem function on 2,100 acres of pristine wetlands and 100 miles of streams. Unfortunately, the mitigation plan only proposes 3 small projects: incremental improvements to existing municipal wastewater treatment systems that serve less than 700 people, upgrading of some existing road culverts, and cleanup of debris on a single beach. Based on a careful review of the proposed mitigation projects and using the concept of quality acres, it is my professional opinion that these mitigation projects would almost certainly offset less than 10% of the mine's impacts and would likely offset less than 1%. This is clearly inadequate for impacts in such a sensitive setting. Thank you for your time. I yield the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Richard. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Dave Chambers from the Center for Science and Public Participation. He'll get into additional details of the mine plan and impacts to Bristol Bay's waterways, as well as some technical and design flaws and financial issues. Dr. Chambers.
Good morning. Yes, I was looking mainly at the engineering and mining engineering parts of the environmental impact statement. I'd like to first reemphasize a conclusion made by Rich Borden about the lack of a feasibility study and the fact that that probably means the mine is not economical. I'd like to point out that of all the large mine proposals or expansion proposals in Alaska for the last 20 years, these have all been accompanied by a feasibility study. Now, what the lack of this feasibility study says, in addition to looking at the economics of the mine, it basically says we don't have a realistic mine scenario. This is not a mining scenario that makes engineering sense. And because this is an unrealistic mine scenario, it's led to some serious omissions of potential impacts in the EIS. And I'd like to talk about several of those. First of all, the EIS predicts no impacts to the Tulare Creek drainage. That's one of the 3 major drainages that the mine sits in. The proposed open pit stops carefully at the south boundary of the Cockatoolie and Tulare Creek drainage boundary. However, if the resource is to be developed beyond the 10% proposed by PLP in its mine proposal, then that open pit boundary is not only going to extend into the Tulare Creek and impact it, but all of the waste rock dumps that are proposed, and this is by the mining company's own plan, would be in the Tulare Creek drainage. That means that in the end, the Tulare Creek drainage, which is predicted to have no impacts, is actually going to be the drainage that suffers the maximum amount of impacts in the long term. The only closure scenario for the mine is to backfill the acidic waste into the open pit. But if that's done, you can't do any further mining. And furthermore, you can't put any of that waste into the pit until mining is completed. So that creates two problems that don't make engineering sense. First is the cost of moving all of that waste a second time from a temporary tailings impoundment into the pit. That's very expensive, and the mining industry almost always says that moving waste twice is uneconomic. The second thing is if you move all that waste back into the pit, you can't mine anything more in that pit without pulling the waste back out again. And that just doesn't make economic sense. Even the state commenters, the state technical commenters have said that's not a realistic closure scenario, but that's the only one we have to evaluate. And because it's not realistic, we're not looking at what's probably going to happen at real closure, which is the acidic waste is going to remain in the impoundment. And there's been no analysis of what that waste sitting in that location in terms of its potential failure modes. There's no analysis of that in the EIS. The EIS also touts the fact that no cyanide is going to be used, but there's a considerable amount of gold value that's being left in the tailings by not using cyanide. And again, cyanide use doesn't make any engineering sense or economic sense, and it's a virtual certainty in the long run, yet isn't being analyzed in the environmental impact statement. In addition, PLP has not collected for the EIS some of the necessary geotechnical data, excuse me, that is on the tailings dam. And they have not conducted the required modeling of the dams under seismic loading. Now they say that they promised to do that, but that means that the public has no opportunity to evaluate the results. So we're missing something that's usually there for analysis in a typical EIS. Finally, I just want to make a comment about the EIS. This EIS is a time-driven document, and this is essentially the model that was recently proposed by the Trump administration, that is a 2-year timeline. And that's essentially what this EIS was done under, basically 2 years. The environmental impact statement, as envisioned by the National Environmental Policy Act, was supposed to be a data-driven process, with science identifying the risks and mitigation measures for those risks. A time-driven process does not allow full science-based analysis. It only allows for as much science that can be done in the time allowed. And this is probably why we see such poor analysis in tailings dam design issues like seismic stability, dam foundation geotechnical analysis, and evaluating the long-term risks of failures. Thank you very much. I'll stop there and happy to field questions at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. We're holding questions to the end of the presentations. We'll next hear from Dr. Cam Wobus. He will address some of the unique conditions that make Bristol Bay an incredibly risky setting for this type of mine. And he'll describe a range of shortcomings of Pebble's plans for mining waste at the mine site or managing waste at the mine site. Dr. Wobus?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. And can everyone hear me, first of all?
Yes.
All right, great. And thanks, Dave and Rich, for that background. That's really helpful. My name's Cameron Wobus. I'm a senior scientist at Linker Technologies in Boulder, Colorado. My graduate degrees are in hydrology and geomorphology, so really my expertise is understanding how water and sediment move around on landscapes. I first got to visit Bristol Bay in about 1995, and I've been studying the hydrology of the site for about a decade. I want to actually start by taking a brief step back from Pebble and contrast it with all of the largest copper mines in the US. And if you look at all those mines, they're in the desert Southwest, where the water table is typically tens to hundreds of feet below ground. And the open pits that are left behind from those mines end up becoming basically collection points for groundwater and surface water. So even though the water that gets into those pits becomes toxic when it's exposed to the atmosphere, really none of it's going anywhere except evaporating. Bristol Bay is a very, very different place. Instead of a water table that's hundreds of feet deep, it's often right at the surface. Instead of 10 or 15 inches of rain per year, the Pebble deposit receives 40 to 50 inches of rain per year. And really, if you talk to anyone who's been there, they'll tell you it's like walking around on a giant sponge. So what that means is that if Pebble is developed, it will become a huge water and waste management challenge, which the EIS acknowledges will need to be actively managed in perpetuity forever. And Rich hinted at that earlier. So even if everything Rich and Dave have said is wrong, and they're only going to develop 10 to 15% of this deposit, the mine will still create huge amounts of toxic waste that will need to be kept segregated forever from everything that flows downstream in a place where water is literally everywhere. So if you add to that the fact that the Pebble deposit is in a seismically active part of the US and half of the world's wild sockeye come from those rivers downstream, what that means is that the margin for error for this mine is incredibly low, which means the bar that should be set for this EIS should be incredibly high. And from my review of both the draft and the final EIS, this EIS fails to meet even a low bar for scientific credibility. Just a few examples, the water balance that determines how much water they'll need to manage is not consistent with their own measured data. The models they use to simulate mining impacts on hydrology weren't designed to simulate this type of a really coupled groundwater surface water system. And a lot of the conclusions in the EIS are based on simple assertions. I have a long list of them rather than data or published literature. They just assert something and you're supposed to accept that as fact. I have detailed comments on all of these, which I'm happy to discuss, but I really want to highlight just one example as an illustration of how this sort of sloppy science comes out in this EIS. So at the draft EIS stage, a number of commenters, including EPA, the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, and myself, indicated that a tailings dam failure really should be considered in this final environmental impact statement. And we at Linker actually developed a model of what a dam failure might look like on the downstream environment. In the final EIS, however, right on page 2 of the executive summary, the Army Corps digs in its heels and states that the risk of a tailings dam failure is too low to warrant consideration. And they say that's the case because of, quote, the permeable flow-through design for the bulk tailings storage facility, or TSF. The problem with that is that it's based entirely on an assertion that a tailings storage facility they haven't even designed yet will work. The bulk tailings facility design is only conceptual. From the information that's included in the EIS, though, it's clear that this tailings facility plan systematically rejects best available technologies for tailings management. And there's a list in one of the appendices of best available technologies that came out of that after the Mount Poly failure and how they systematically reject every one of them. So instead, they're relying on this flow-through design and thickened tailings that Pebble asserts will ensure that the tailings facility will drain through time and become a dry, and they put dry in quotations, a dry landform. So after rejecting all of these tried and true best available technologies, the EIS simply relies on an assertion that this conceptual tailings design will allow the tailings to drain through time and become a stable landform. But what's interesting is that just in the past few months, engineers from both the Army Corps' own third-party contractor and the Alaska Dam Safety Program have raised serious doubts about whether this conceptual tailings management plan will actually work. And in a nutshell, what these engineers have pointed out is that the thickened tailings that they're proposing to put in this facility are not likely to segregate into coarse and fine fractions as other tailings tend to do, which will prevent them from being able to drain. The EIS even includes the following caveat. It says, quote, although the design is intended to promote unsaturated conditions and therefore stability, the majority of tailings may remain saturated throughout operations and potentially into post-closure. So in other words, even though the EIS asserts that the tailings will dry and stabilize through time, so there's no need to model a tailings dam failure, it simultaneously acknowledges that maybe they won't. And if you read this EIS carefully, the same type of caveat and sloppiness is present throughout the water balance, the groundwater model, and a whole bunch of other sections of this document. So just to summarize, that's just one example, but no one who's paying attention to this mine plan expects that the mine described in the EIS would actually be the final footprint, because really no one in their right mind would invest billions of dollars to build a mine with the intent of leaving 90% of the ore in the ground. And Rich and Dave already spoke to that. But even the waste generated from this much smaller mine footprint that they're proposing can't possibly be kept segregated from the system downstream, particularly if they don't have anything other than conceptual plans to do that. So when contaminants are inevitably released from this headwaters mine site, whether it's through routine operations, catastrophic failures, or importantly, after the mine is abandoned, everything downstream is potentially at risk. And that is really not captured at all in this environmental impact statement. I'll leave it at that, and I can take questions later as well.
Thank you, Dr. Wobus. Before we hear from the next presenter, I'd like to ask the media to type questions in the chat box or to raise your hand or something, or type something in the box to let us know to unmute you during the questions and answers. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Gordon Reeves. As Bristol Bay is the heart of salmon country, we'll hear from Dr. Reeves about some of the issues with the EIS, and particularly its failure to consider the impacts this mine would have on our salmon. Dr. Reeves?
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. My name's Gordon Reeves, and I was responsible for reviewing the portions of the EIS that considered the potential effects on fish. Just as a bit of my background, I have a PhD in fisheries from Oregon State University and over 40 years of experience as a research fish scientist focusing on the freshwater ecology of Pacific salmon. I work primarily in the Pacific Northwest in Alaska, including more than 25 years on the Copper River Delta, and have published more than 80 papers during my career. I also was a member of the EPA panel that reviewed the mine previously. Each year, between 40 and 60 million wild salmon return to the rivers of Bristol Bay, making it one of the most productive wild salmon ecosystems in the world. And as Rich noted, it provides nearly half of the world's supply of sockeye salmon. And the Nuchagak River, whose headwaters would be impacted by the mine, has the largest run of king salmon in Alaska. For millennia, salmon have provided native communities in Bristol Bay with critical subsistence food resources, and each year it supports 14,000 commercial and recreational fishing jobs that generate $1.5 billion. The proposed mine threatens to disrupt the health and productivity of salmon in Bristol Bay. As currently designed, the mine will destroy 105 miles of salmon streams and over 2,300 acres of critical wetlands in the headwaters of the Nuchagak and the Kobijak rivers, two of the more productive watersheds in the Bristol Bay region. As we heard, this is an unlikely scenario, and the larger scenario of a 78-year mine indicates that at least a minimum of loss of 11,000 acres and 335 miles of stream. The Army Corps dismisses the impacts of the operation of the mine to salmon and other native fish, but there is a glaring absence of support for this contention in the EIS. The analysis in the EIS falls woefully short of even the minimum standards required to adequately identify the potential effects of the proposed mine on a pristine ecosystem and its valuable salmon resources. The Corps depended extensively on models to assess the impact of flow and flow alterations, which is one of the major effects of the mine. The validity and ability of these models to discern and assess ecological changes in a system as dynamic as Bristol Bay were seriously questioned in scientific literature. The Corps blatantly ignored or dismissed these concerns. The EIS analysis violated assumptions required to use the model, failed to address known and acknowledged shortcomings of the model, and failed to recognize how errors were propagated by the use of multiple models. Involved agencies made repeated requests for the EIS to address inherent uncertainties associated with the use and results derived from the suite of models, which is done in even rudimentary science undertakings. In response, the Corps continued to present more data from the models, which is not what was requested. Recognizing and considering uncertainty associated with an analysis or study is critical when deciding on a course of action. As a consequence, results in the EIS are presented with an unsupported and false level of precision and certainty. The EIS failed to properly consider basic tenets of the ecology of Pacific salmon. Salmon populations in Bristol Bay, like salmon populations everywhere, are highly adapted to local environmental conditions. As an example, water temperature influences growth and physiology, and the local populations generally have a relatively narrow range in which they perform best. The EIS used water temperatures from populations outside of Bristol Bay and outside of Alaska to assess the potential effects of increases in water temperature resulting from the mine operation. This was done despite a clear warning by the author of the report from which the water temperatures were taken against applying those temperatures to populations in Alaska. The EIS continually dismisses small changes in environmental conditions as being non-consequential and contends that in some cases they are beneficial to salmon and other native fish in the affected streams. However, this is completely false. The EIS also assessed the direct effects of changes in environmental conditions that will result from the mine, blatantly ignoring likely cascading ecological effects that will result from the changes in these conditions. For example, the Corps concluded that an increase in winter water temperatures would not have lethal effects on developing eggs and embryos. This is likely true, but warmer winter temperatures will result in fry emerging earlier and being smaller than under baseline conditions. That, in turn, could reduce their survival. Additionally, the timing of future life history events would likely be altered, potentially affecting overall survival. There are multiple other examples of this type of flawed analysis dealing with the alteration of flows, loss of off-channel habitat, and heavy metal contamination. The EIS and supporting documents contends that climate change will have little to no effect on salmon in Bristol Bay and never considered how it would interact with potential effects from the mine. However, there is a wealth of evidence in the scientific literature and results from the SNAP program at the University of Fairbanks, which has localized climate projections for the area of the projected mine to suggest that climate change will be pronounced. And Dave Wobus has also done some seminal work on climate change in this area, dealing with flows. The effects of the mine will compound the challenges of climate change to salmon and other native fish in Bristol Bay. The productivity of salmon in Bristol Bay and elsewhere depends on the aggregate behavior of populations, not on a single population. The size of an individual population varies widely from high to low through time. However, populations do not do this synchronously. From year to year, some populations will be abundant when others have low returns, and then the pattern is reversed. The result of this behavior is that there is a large variation in the abundance of a given local population, but the aggregate or portfolio of abundance in the entire Bristol region is relatively stable. The EIS falsely contends that the loss of populations in the vicinity of the mine would not have an effect on the overall productive capacity of the Bristol Bay region. This is a total misrepresentation of the science pertaining to salmon, and in fact, the loss of a population could have significant impact on the future production of salmon in Bristol Bay. The EIS also fails to consider the importance of ecological diversity of the local population to the persistence of Bristol Bay populations over time. Two of the three rivers directly affected by the mine, the North Fork and the South Fork of the Tulare River, support sockeye salmon that have a unique life history, which is that they rear in fresh water for a short time before migrating to the ocean, rather than spending 1 to 3 years in a lake prior to seaward migration. These unique salmon are responsible for colonizing new habitats, which contribute to the long-term productivity and health of the broader Bay salmon portfolio. The loss of this unique life history type from part of the Nutragack River would not only affect the productivity of the Nutragack, but also the overall Bristol Bay portfolio. As a result of the failure to recognize the importance of individual populations, the EIS dramatically underestimates the impact of the Pebble Mine on salmon production in Bristol Bay. In summary, the EIS fails to meet the most basic requirements of a credible scientific assessment. A decision to allow the mine to go forward based on the highly questionable analysis and conclusions will likely result in irreversible ecological damage to the fish in the affected streams and the overall productivity of Bristol Bay, which in turn will have detrimental economic and social impacts on the community of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reeves. To conclude this morning's panel, we'll hear from George Alexie, President of the Nundalton Tribal Council, which was a tribal cooperating agency throughout the EIS process. Nundalton is also the community closest to the Pebble Mine. He'll share some of the challenges they face as a tribal cooperating agency in the process and the Corps' refusal to listen to tribal concerns. Mr. Alexie?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is George Alexie. I'm president of Nundalton Tribal Council. Nundalton is a small community where residents live in a subsistence way of life. We are the closest community to Pebble Mine, and the mine site lies in the heart of our traditional area. As a tribal government, Nundalton has sought at the onset of the permitting process sit at the table and be part of the cooperating agency process. We did not want to just sit back and have this process roll out with our tribes on the sidelines. But from the start of the Army Corps, did everything they possibly could to keep the tribes and local people out of this process. At first, they denied our request to be a cooperating agency. The folks here in Alaska talked down on us, saying, "We don't need you to do that. You have other ways to communicate our concerns." It took our tribal council going all the way to Washington, D.C. and meeting with officials at the Pentagon before our request was approved. We had to travel 3,000 miles to get a seat at the table where a project 13 miles away from us is happening. That is how bad our relationship with the Corps has been. Over the course of the permitting process, everything was done to keep our input to a minimum. In the closed-door operating agency meetings, our tribe was limited to topics of the EIS we could speak to. We were not allowed to review certain chapters of sections because of the people at the Corps said it was outside our expertise. They have never viewed non-Dalton tribe as being part of this process, and they invented every excuse to keep us from it. At consultations, the Tribal Council explained to the Corps staff that this project would mean to our community and how it would affect our way of life. Time and time again, we were told we were overblowing the impacts that could have. Just trust the process and would lead us to the right result. In meetings about our cultural resources, the Corps staff openly argued with our tribal elders about the locations and importance of places our people consider religiously significant. The EIS release today is not a legitimate document. It is a product of deceit and underhanded tactics by a federal agency more interested in pleasing a Canadian mining company than listening to our local people. It is shameful. The Army Corps plays its games. They say a decision has not yet been made on a permit. I'm here to tell you a decision was made even before Pebble filed for this permit. The Army Corps did everything in its power to ensure Pebble get its permit, including talking all over the tribe. Although the permitting process may be over, I'm here to tell you that non-Dalton, joined by our allies across the country, will never stop fighting to protect our way of life. The Army Corps and the Pebble Partnership will not win while we are here. That is a fact. All they've done today is waste a bunch of paper by publishing this EIS, because our fight is far from over. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, President Alexi. As you've heard today, Pebble's plan is incomplete. The Army Corps has failed to take a hard look at the damage it will do to Bristol Bay. Pebble will destroy thousands of acres of wetlands that nurture Bristol Bay salmon. It will make our home a testing ground for new, unproven mining technology. It will come with toxic tailings our region, the people in our region will have to deal with in perpetuity, forever. Something that we cannot identify with in these days is that we've heard medical professionals say that COVID-19, it's not a matter of if you're going to get infected, it's a matter of when. With the Pebble Mine, it's not a matter of if it's going to be, if its contamination will occur, but it's just a matter of when it will occur. The EIS fails to address the reality, what the science has long been, in that this project will devastate our region and must be stopped. Bristol Bay is not meant to be a mining district. We're salmon people. We've inherited the responsibility from our ancestors to be strong stewards of this amazing place, and will not waver in protecting it for future generations. It's clear the time is now for our elected leaders to stop this project by holding the government accountable. The EPA has the authority and responsibility to stop the Pebble Mine. Our fight is far from over. We'll continue to use every tool available to us, from Congress to the courts, to protect our way of life. There will be no compromise, and we will never stop. The fight will continue. We were here long before Pebble, and we will be here long after Pebble is gone. Thank you again to the panelists and all of you who tuned in. Now I'll turn it over to another member of our team today, Sam Snyder. Sam is our tech guru who will facilitate the questions from the media. Thank you. Sam?
Awesome. Thanks. Thanks to the panelists. This was really great. We have a lot of press on the line, and we'll get to questions. The first question was from Bellamy in Seattle, and this is less of a technical question and more sort of a coalition question. So part of my job is working to help facilitate the broader coalition in response to the Pebble Mine. So I'm actually going to take this first one. But Bellamy asked that she's in the greater Seattle area where thousands of commercial fishermen depend upon the runs of salmon in Bristol Bay. And can someone address the broader reach of concerns and how this might play into successful opposition? And I think the first thing to note, Bellamy, is that, if you look at commercial fishermen for Bristol Bay or businesses for Bristol Bay, you'll see that the coalition working to protect Bristol Bay, following behind and supporting United Tribes of Bristol Bay and the regional Native communities is wide, strong. From 2010 to 2014, and 2+ million Americans commented on the Bristol Bay watershed assessment in its various drafts and final form. The overwhelming majority of those in favor of protecting Bristol Bay. I think you're right to point out that this is the salmon have a broad cultural impact, but also a broad community and economic reach around the world. And I think you see that in the continued response to Pebble. And but we can, if you're interested in some of the commercial fishing dialogue, we can put you in touch with some of those voices and those leaders as well. I think this next two questions though go probably for Dave Chambers, and then Rich and Cam if y'all want to weigh in as well. But James Marshall from E&E News asks two questions. One, Tom Collier told him that Pebble has not released a complete feasibility study because potential investors do their own feasibility studies before making a decision. His question is that standard practice? And then his second question is what type of tailings dams would be safer than the flow-through design and why? So Dave, I feel like both of those, actually Rich, maybe the first part, the feasibility would be for you, and then Dave will kick the tailings dam question to you as well. So Rich, I'm gonna unmute you and I'll let you take that first piece. Nope. Hang on, Rich. We're gonna unmute you. I don't know why. Maybe unmute yourself. It's not working.
Yep. Okay. Sorry. I've now unmuted myself. I was just going to say a small junior mining company that is desperately seeking investors. I would think one of the best strategies they would have to attract an investor would be to commission an independent, rigorous financial evaluation showing that their mine plan makes money. We all know that the Pebble Partnership has been struggling finding and retaining investors. So it just makes good business sense for them to release a rigorous financial evaluation of this mine plan if they are serious about attracting an investor and they're confident that it's going to be a moneymaker. I'd also like to point people to Northern Dynasty's website. And if you click on Pebble Project and then go to Project Economics, the website itself says that, and I quote, Northern Dynasty anticipates having a complete understanding and being able to properly assess all of the proposed alternatives that the Corps of Engineers will be considering as part of the scoping process conducted during the initial phase of the EIS, so that an economic analysis can be completed. Scoping was done, 2 years ago? This doesn't explicitly say it, but it implies that they were waiting for the scoping to be done to do a financial evaluation, but that seems to have gone by the wayside.
Sam, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you, Dave.
Okay, I might just add to what Rich said. If you want an example of a small junior mining company that has a big mining property that's trying to promote it, look at the KSM project in British Columbia. actually a project very similar to Pebble, proposal to mine a large copper porphyry ore body, again, by a junior mining company, also in an area with significant water to deal with, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the same concerns as Pebble, but they recently came out with their second economic feasibility report. Again, as Rich says, because they're trying to attract investors. So not having that feasibility report is very unusual, as I mentioned. Now, with regard to tailings dam, what the safest tailings dam design would be a downstream type dam that is your classic triangular shaped tailings dam with an internal impermeable barrier to keep water out of the dam. You do not want water to get into a dam because that makes it unstable from several technical aspects. So the flow through design, hopefully it will work. It has been done before, but it's not the safest proposal. And the centerline construction that they're proposing, although it's a fairly good technology, it's not the best. So to say that this is the safest proposal is not recognizing accepted practices.
If I could just add a little to that also, I believe the final EIS still assumes the tailings will only be thickened to 55% solids. If there are concerns about contained water, even using modified conventional thickeners, it's possible to get that contained solids up to over 60%. And of course, even safer options, paste tailings and things like that, which admittedly do come with a cost and operational issues at the proposed scale. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Rich and Dave. Our next, we have a couple of questions about legal action, and UTBB legal representative Matt Newman is on the line. So I'm actually going to call him to the panel, even though he wasn't expecting to be on the panel. Hey, Matt, great to have you here. But both from Alex de Marvin and let's see, Bellamy, questions are: what are the plans for legal action? And when might we see a lawsuit filed? Would it be challenging the EIS itself or waiting for the permit? So we will kick it to you, Matt.
All right, well, there are within the coalition many organizations, many of whom have legal counsel, including the United Tribes of Bristol Bay. Currently, we are, like the experts you've heard from this morning, we are evaluating the chapters and appendices of the EIS. From a legal perspective, we're identifying many of the same omissions and issues with the EIS that cause great concern. As far as legal action itself, there is still one more very important publication that must come from the Army Corps, and that is the Record of Decision. That document is the actual up or down decision on Pebble Mine that will either allow the mining company to have a Clean Water Act permit to dredge and fill the waters and wetlands of the United States that the EIS allegedly describes the impacts to. And for legal process purposes, no challenge to a permit decision or to the adequacy of an EIS may occur until that record of decision is published. So we will continue to evaluate the EIS, wait for the record of decision, see what it contains, and then evaluate all of our options. But I will say this morning that based on the work the Army Corps has provided us thus far. I don't think anyone is expecting the record of decision to be a thorough or stellar document, and will likely be subject to the same inadequacies that we've seen in both this final EIS as well as its previous iterations. So stay tuned, I guess, is the answer on the legal question.
Thank you, Matt. I think this next question is probably for Gordy. Gordy, this is from Ashley Braun, who's a freelance journalist. And she says, on page 2 of the EPA's letter to the Corps on May 28th, EPA called out the existence of a genetically distinct population of sockeye in the Coktuli River. Can someone speak to the significance of this population and the fact that the EPA included this call out specifically when they wrote, we would like to reiterate that such information should be reflected in the Corps' permit record. And so, Gordy, I don't know if you have any insights on that genetically distinct population and how important it is that the Corps take that into consideration.
Did request to.
Hang on, Gordy, start over. We just got you off mute.
Okay.
Sorry. There you go.
Yeah, we were aware of that letter, and we made repeated requests and inquiries with Alaska Department of Fish and Game to obtain that information, but we were unable to. They contend that it's still in the review process. But regardless of that, as I pointed out, there's a unique life history type that they're talking about, which is this sea sockeye, which is the primary life history type in the vicinity of the mine. And we know that, well, two things. We know first that is the real role of that is of that life history type is it's a colonizer. It's out seeking new environments to keep population going, the sockeye population going, because the areas of production are not stable. They tend to blink on and off over time. So these populations allow the greater population to persist in the landscape. And we also know that the loss of this life history type could be quite significant. So whether if it's genetically unique or not, it's very unique from a life history perspective, and its loss could have quite significant impacts on the overall production of sockeye within Bristol Bay.
Awesome. Thanks, Gordy.
Okay.
I am not seeing any other hands raised or any other questions. I don't know if Alana or Team UTBB want to say any final words to wrap this up. Or Ralph?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sam. I think George Alexi and Randy Kukarik from Untitled Tribal Council had some final thoughts. Can you hear me?
And before we go to them, I want to just flag that we've had a couple questions. We will be providing both video, audio, and I think written copies of the statements made for the press. So give us a few minutes after the press conference, and we'll download the video, package it up, and make sure that it's available to press to pull clips from. So thank you all for joining us. Oh, and actually, I'm sorry, before we go, we did have another question that I missed about subsistence. What other subsistence foods would be affected by the mine beyond just salmon? And I'm not sure who we want to kick that one to. It's broad, it's diverse.
I think George and Randy are a good pair to answer that question.
Okay, great.
Yes, hi, this is Randy. So we have a wide range of plant life. There is a continued return of migratory birds. There's moose, caribou, and I do believe they covered some of this in the EIS, but like the big one is salmon, of course, but the wide range of natural resources that is within our region, I feel like that was missed and it needs more detail on that.
And then we actually have another question that just came in from Ashley Braun. I'd love to hear more about the compensatory mitigation and how the fact that the LEDPA means one of the 3 proposed projects, the marine debris cleanup at Amactadori, is no longer in contention because of the port move to Diamond Point. Or Rich?
Am I muted?
You are good to talk, Rich.
Okay, I'm afraid the compensatory mitigation plan has not been updated since the change of transportation corridor. So I really can't comment on what will be in or out of the future plan, but I'm anxious to see it when it is produced.
I think it's also important to note that is it Iggy Yagig, who owns Diamond Point, has made it quite clear that Pebble's not allowed on that land. So there are land access questions about the new route, serious land access questions about the new route in the final EIS that have not been addressed, let alone compensatory mitigation. So more questions than answers at this point. And a follow-up on that, maybe Matt, if we can call to you again. So from RG Bauman asks, 2 Alaska Native entities have made it clear they will not allow access to their privately owned lands for use by PLP to proceed. Army Corps in the past has declined to allow a mining project to move forward because lands were not available. Is this a grounds for legal challenge, and how are they squaring this discrepancy in this particular case?
Well, it's certainly irregular, and I base that upon both here in Alaska as well as projects the Army Corps has overseen elsewhere in the United States. The choice of a LEDPRA that does not come with either land ownership rights or access rights is a first when it comes to Pebble. In previous cases, including here in Alaska, the Corps has excluded particular alternatives or transportation routes that the project proponent did not have a legal right to access the property. And in this case, we heard from Mr. David Hobby, who is the chief of the regulatory arm at the Alaska Army Corps, who said in response to a similar question from the media that in this case, they were allowing it to go forward because the project proponent, i.e. Pebble, has assured the Corps that they will get access somehow, and therefore the Corps has accepted that representation as part of its choice of the practicable alternative. Now, I want to emphasize, as you've heard from experts earlier in the call, this is a theme in the EIS, whether it's the tailings impoundment facility or it's the land access. The Army Corps is merely taking the word of the applicant. There's no real analysis or examination of objective fact. Pebble says it is so, and therefore it is so. And at least from the legal perspective, I can tell you it's those kinds of irregularities in the process that give rise to legal challenge, and particularly for major landowners along the transportation corridor. They've been very vocal about their refusal to allow this private company to access their lands. And I have no doubt that they will defend their private property from access and use any legal challenge available to them to defend their rights as property owners.
Thanks, Matt. We have a question from the panelists that has their hand raised. so I'm just going to allow them to talk. And you don't have to listen to me. I think you are good to ask a question. Maybe not. Okay. I'm getting texts about other questions. Cam, there were many questions on the to the Corps on the draft EIS regarding catastrophic tailings dam failure. How has the Army Corps handled tailings dam failure in the final EIS?
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, essentially they haven't. They've basically just reiterated the fact that this tailings dam won't fail. And so I kind of highlighted that in my comments earlier. They, rather than embarking on a study of what a tailings dam failure might look like, they've just reasserted that this tailings dam won't fail because of the thickened tailings and the flow-through dam design. They do highlight pretty prominently in the draft EIS and the final EIS the impacts of the spill scenario that they did consider for the bulk tailings facility, which is a pipeline rupture where the tailings that are being delivered to the tailings facility end up spewing out on the landscape because of an earthquake. So the scenario is an earthquake ruptures the tailings delivery pipeline, and that those tailings are spread out on the landscape for about 6 hours before it's shut off. So they highlight kind of the minimal environmental impact of that tailings scenario that they did consider, but they really just, they don't consider a full tailings dam failure, again, kind of relying on this thickened tailings deposition, flow through dam design, and the fact that they don't think that the tailings dam will fail because of that.
I can also confirm that the final EIS, they didn't change the size of that pipeline break scenario from the draft EIS. It still only releases 0.004% of the total bulk tailings that need to be stored on site forever safely. It's a tiny release scenario.
Thanks, Rich. So we're past the hour. We're at 10:05, and I'm noticing a number of press are starting to drop off. A handful have dropped off. So maybe go back to Ralph for some parting words. And again, thanks everybody for being on, and to our panelists for helping provide information. And again, we'll get video, audio, and written transcript out to press and contact information if there's any follow-up. So thanks again. But Ralph.
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for facilitating this part. Due to bandwidth issues, I'm not able to join Zoom. And I want to thank all that have joined us, especially the technical experts that we heard from today, and for our representatives from Mundalton to add some real reality and a local voice to the issue. Again, I want to say that that our fight isn't over. We're going to continue doing what we have to do to protect our land and our people, and we'll continue to be united behind this. Again, thanks to all of you. Alana, do you have any closing remarks?
No, you summed it up. Thanks so much to everybody for tuning in, and to the amazing panel for such good information today. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.